and welcome to another episode of Maps and Metaphors. This is Pranav, and today we have Chantal as a guest on this podcast episode. Chantal is from Netherlands, and she is a language enthusiast. She has traveled different places in this world and has exposure to quite many languages. And we are going to talk about language families in this episode, and also if there are any similarities or dissimilarities between them. And majorly in this episode, we will be covering the Chinese group of languages, which is also known as Sino-Tibetan. And of course, like more of the details from other families, language families, we will cover in the following episodes. So yeah, let's get started. So welcome, Chantal.
Thank you.
So Chantal, which languages do you speak?
Well, I have a history of learning a lot of different languages, not all of them to the degree of fluency.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, I can speak my own native language, which is Dutch, English, of course, Chinese, and a bit of German as well.
Interesting.
And
So you say you speak Dutch. So which language family does it belong to?
well, the Dutch language, it belongs to this family called Germanic languages. And this family also includes English and German and some Northern European languages like Swedish, Danish, and some others. So Dutch, it's quite similar to German. They belong to the same family, and I think these two languages are most closely related in this family. There are a lot of words, a lot of vocabulary that is similar, grammar structures that is also very similar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. And if you say, of course, the Germanic languages from Europe, are there more languages that are from Europe, or let's say the branch from Europe? Like,
Yeah, so the Germanic languages is only a small part of all the languages we have. Of course, Europe has so many small countries, so many different languages,
mm-hmm.
and there are a lot of different language families within Europe. So, for example, we have the Romance languages. That's another family which covers Latin, Spanish, Italian, and some other languages. So that's another big group.
Yeah.
And if you look at it more widely, then we have the family called Indo-European. And that covers basically all the different language groups, including the Germanic, Romance, and then we also have, for example, Slavic languages like Russian and other more Eastern European languages.
Yeah, I think Indo-European languages is like a broader category, right? And
Yeah.
when we talk about the Germanic language, you also say that you did mention about the Greek and Latin, right? Or
Greek and Latin, it's there are basically some different families, again, underneath the whole Indo-European language family. So Greek is a pretty small group. It's called the Hellenic family, but it basically only covers Greek and Macedonian language.
mm-hmm.
And Latin is another family again. Like Greek and Latin, I think they have influenced each other quite a lot in the Roman Empire, like Greece and the country that's now Italy. They influenced each other a lot. Like they spoke both languages, both Greek and Latin.
Yeah, yeah.
And both languages have influenced a lot of other languages now as well. Like you see in Dutch, in German, in English, there are actually a lot of words that are derived from Latin or from Greek for that matter.
Okay, so there are actually influences from Greek and Latin in the Germanic language too, right?
Yes, yes. So I studied Latin and Old Greek in school, in high school, and I noticed that a lot of words in, well, English, German, in Dutch, especially more advanced vocabulary, more difficult words. But usually those are derived from Latin. So if
Interesting.
you're learning a new language, like you're learning English or German, and you get to the more advanced level, it can help a lot if you have some background in Latin, because it can help you guess what these new words might mean.
Yeah, it's interesting to know. Um, so maybe going into the next part of our conversation, I would like to know, Chantal, do you speak any other languages?
Um, yes, so I talk mostly about the Germanic languages so far,
Yeah.
like Greek and Latin a bit. I did study Russian a little bit for about a year or so, and Russian falls under the Slavic languages, which
Mm-hmm.
is again also an Indo-European language. So we're still in that family right now.
Mm-hmm. Right, right. So, because you learned Russian, did you see any similarities or any dissimilarity too, between Slavic and Germanic languages?
Well, grammar-wise, I think it's very different because the Russian grammar is a lot more complicated than the Germanic languages that I know.
Mm-hmm.
But grammar-wise, it might have some similarity with the logic behind it with German, because German also has some more grammar than Dutch and English, for example.
Yeah.
And there's also some vocabulary that sounds like Russian vocabulary that sounds a bit like a German word or an English word or a Dutch word.
Yeah. And in
So
terms
they're
of
definitely
the,
not.
sorry, and in terms
Sorry.
of the vocabulary, like when we say subject, object, verb, and there are some languages which use subject, verb, object. Um, are those kind of rules similar in Germanic and Slavic languages?
Well, I think for that aspect, there's not much difference.
Okay.
No, the word order it's pretty similar.
Okay.
I think because they still belong to the same big language group of like Indo-European. Like
Right.
most
Right.
of them will have similar word order.
Right. And other than like Indo-European languages, if you see, what other languages do you speak?
Well, going outside of that group, I have some experience with some Asian languages as well.
Okay. Interesting.
Mostly Chinese, Mandarin Chinese. Chinese has a lot of different dialects, but I studied the Mandarin kind.
Yeah.
And my Chinese, it's quite fluent by now. I've studied it for more than 3 years,
Wow.
and yeah, it's a long time. It's a very interesting language. There's always more to discover, more to learn. So it's very interesting. And apart from Chinese, I studied in South Korea for half a year. And while I was there, I also studied the language a bit. So I also got some experience seeing how that language works because it's most of it is very different from Chinese, but there are also some things that are quite similar actually.
Can you tell us some
Mm.
interesting things, like, or maybe give a background on how the alphabets in Chinese or let's say even Korean languages are different from the Latin ones? How does one starts with understanding them? Because I somehow uh, had one conversation where I understood like the alphabets in Chinese itself have a lot of meaning inside it. So it's almost very similar to the word that we have in Latin languages. Uh, is my understanding correct, or maybe can you explain a little bit of the rules behind it, or how is that formed, or? some interesting details behind it before going into the
Yes,
detail. Yeah.
yes, sure. So for Chinese, the Chinese script has a very long history, thousands of years.
Mm-hmm.
And it started out, like the basics started as kind of drawings of something. They drew something that looked like a mountain, that looked like a cow or a horse or anything.
Yeah.
And from the drawing, you could recognize what they meant. And over time, that developed into, well, more standardized versions instead of just some person's drawing.
Mm-hmm.
And new words got added, more abstract characters as well, which were just, well, someone just decided how they would write them. And at some point, that got standardized. And these days, there are, well, over 10,000 of different characters. Some of them are based on the more like a picture. So if you see it, you can maybe guess what it might mean. Other
Mm.
characters are more developed from, well, a meaning or just random, and people just agreed that it would mean a certain thing. And
Okay.
the main difference with the Chinese scripts and almost any other language in the world is that they don't have an alphabet. So every character is different, and every character indicates a certain meaning, a certain word. So it can take a lot of time to actually become literate in Chinese language,
Mm.
because you have to know about 3,000 characters at least to be comfortable in using the language, like reading books, writing papers. You have to know at least 3,000 characters, which makes it very time consuming, of course, to learn all of them.
Yeah. Certainly. It really makes me curious, and I will ask one question. So this seems like more of a language which is based on the visuals, right? It's almost seems to me it's like a picture that you are putting as an alphabet. Let's say, coming
Yes, yes,
from
that's definitely how it started out. And
okay,
then, of course, some abstract words you cannot indicate it with a picture, but a large part of the characters it is based on like a visual. Yes.
okay. But then another question I have: how does the vowels or consonants or even the syllables, fit in the Chinese language?
Well, basically every character,
Yeah.
every drawing character, it stands for one syllable. It will never be pronounced as more than that. It's one character is always just one syllable.
Okay. Okay.
And there's nothing in the character that helps you derive what it can be pronounced as. So this is really something you have to learn. If you encounter a new character that you've never seen before,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes you can guess some direction what it might be pronounced as, but the different tones that you have in the language, that will always be a guess. You really have to memorize that.
Interesting. And how does it work with the articles? Do they have articles in the language?
Chinese is, well, Mandarin Chinese, they have, it's a language that has very little grammar, especially if you compare it to like European languages.
Mm-hmm.
In Chinese, there are no verb conjugations. There's very little grammatical structures.
Okay.
So basically, if I put it very simple, if you know the words you want to put in your sentence, you just put them next to each other and you're finished. You don't have to think about like, oh, where like this verb it has to change, or no, it's basically very, very simple. So you don't have to think much about the grammar when you speak.
Okay. That's also very interesting to know. But do they have the? I mean, is there a word order in Mandarin? Probably, I
Yes,
think.
there is a word order, and it's actually not so different from the European languages I know.
Mm-hmm.
Usually, if you just use the English word order and then translate the sentence into Chinese, there won't be that many changes.
Okay.
So I think that's the only big similarity between Chinese and English and other European languages.
Okay. And everything else kind of really changes, right? In the Chinese
Yes,
group.
every all the other aspects, it's really quite different. Of course, the pronunciation, the fact that Chinese has different tones, which European languages do not have.
What is that?
Well, the tones, it's basically, you can compare it a little bit to in English when you ask a question. If you ask a question, your voice goes up at the end, right? To indicate, oh, I'm asking you something.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And that is basically a tone. Like your voice goes up, your voice can go down, your voice can stay at the same level. And that's what the Chinese language does. So if I give an example, I'll just say it a sound in Chinese and say it in 4 different tones. So you can hear a bit about, well, what it actually means, the tones. So, so we
Interesting.
have the neutral tone, which like, your voice stays on the same level. So you can just say, for example, ma. It's very, very neutral, just stays on the same level. You can also go up, like you would do in a question in English. You can say ma. You can go down as well, ma. Sounds more like you're a bit angry if you exaggerate it a bit. And then there's also a tone that goes up, that goes down and then goes up. This one is a bit tricky for some people. It takes some time to get used to it because you're basically saying ma. It's a bit deeper in your throat, kind of.
Yeah. It's,
And yeah, and every character has its own pronunciation, its own syllable, and its own tone. So these are all things you have to remember.
yeah. Very interesting. Did not know about that. But I'm also curious to know. Um, you just gave me an example of a character or a word. Um, I might be, saying it wrong in the Mandarin context, but correct me if I'm wrong. But my question is more around the sentence. So you said like there is no tone in Mandarin. So if I have to say a sentence, uh, let's say the sky is blue, and then there's an exclamation mark. So maybe I'll say the sky is blue today, or something. Maybe I'm wrong, but how would the sentence? Even the sentence doesn't have a tone in Mandarin.
Well, of course, every word in your sentence will have its own specific tone, like going up or down or not. And you have a good point because you mean like how do you express yourself, right? Because in
Yeah,
English we might play a bit with our tone of voice to indicate that we are like angry or happy or
yeah,
whatever.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and that's in Chinese that's a bit more subtle, I guess, because you can never change the tones of your words because then they sound like other words, so people don't understand you anymore.
Okay.
But there's one very important question then, like how do they ask a question in Chinese?
Yeah.
You cannot go up with your voice because then you change the word. And they have a very smart solution. They just have one specific character that kind of means question mark. So if you add that character at the end of your sentence in speaking, in writing, it just means, oh, this is a question.
Oh, okay.
And this is a bit not very intuitive for speakers of European languages because when they start learning Chinese, you tend to always go up in your voice if you ask a question. But at some point, you're like, no, I shouldn't do that. But it goes automatically because you're just used to doing that all your life. So it takes some time to really switch and get used to staying neutral in your voice, but just using that one question mark word.
Yeah. And what is that character like? If you would like to share, uh, can you even say that character? For example, that's maybe in the written one can identify, but when you're speaking and asking a question, how would that sound?
Well, the character for the question mark, it happens to be pronounced similar as the other examples I gave. It's also pronounced ma, but it's a bit more neutral, so you're not really stressing it. And you
Okay.
just put that at the end of your sentence, and then you have a question. And in written language, it is the same because actually until like the 19th, 20th century, they didn't use any punctuation marks, any question marks in Chinese language. So they
Oh.
really needed these characters that indicated, oh, this is a question. Because otherwise there was no way of knowing. Because the punctuation, like the question mark, like commas, they were introduced in China through European languages.
Hmm.
There was this scholar at at the end of the 19th century. He was sent to Europe to study a bit there and then report back to China. And then he came back with a report like, oh, they use all these little signs in their language. They use commas and dots and exclamation marks and question marks. And at first, China didn't like that. They thought, nah, that's not something we want to use. But they changed their minds a bit later, early 20th century, and at some point it actually got well more standardized. Like they just agreed on which symbols, which punctuation marks they would adopt, and these days everyone uses question marks, exclamation marks, commas, and dots in Chinese.
Yeah, it's that's so interesting to know. But I just wonder why like there were no punctuations, and how was it all, functional? How would people express each other? Was there an alternative to the punctuations? Do you have idea about
Not
that?
really, not really. Just because before, of course, the Chinese language, the written language, it takes a lot of time to learn. So back then, it was not like everyone could read and write. It was mostly like official scholars,
Mm-hmm.
and it was really like some kind of study to really be able to distinguish like where a sentence ends and where the next one begins. And sometimes they did use these characters. Like these days, we only use the question mark character, but back then they also had some characters that would indicate, oh, beginning of a sentence, oh, end of a sentence. So that would be kind of their alternative back then. But they didn't always use that. So sometimes it was really up to the reader to figure out how this sentence works, where it finishes, where it begins, which was open to interpretation sometimes. So it was really not convenient, and that's why at some point they agreed on just using the European punctuation marks, which makes it a lot easier to understand, of course.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Maybe it sounds something like a secret code also to me, So only if you come from a certain region or if you are able to understand a certain person, you might be able to interpret a sentence, or maybe not, If you're not able to interpret it in the right way, maybe it has two different meanings, the same sentence. Maybe you chose the wrong one and it resulted in some kind of a conflict, let's say. Could
Yeah,
be.
and if you read something, you cannot check with the writer what he meant. So it makes it very, very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, just imagining those times, even if I was a student in those times, would probably give up any learning languages, or learning the language, or even like reading writing, because maybe it would be too frustrating for me to even make sense of it, because it seems like, yeah, punctuations are like the essentials. I might be wrong, because maybe they were having like some secret technique which they were comfortable with, because yeah, it was working for them, right? So it's just my opinion. I might be wrong, but it seems There must have been something maybe which is maybe not known or something. I'll just leave it open to interpretation. That how was it really functioning? Because it didn't seem like they were just living under the rock. They were doing a lot of things before the punctuations were adapted or adopted. Sorry. Uh, so yeah, it's really a subject to explore. Maybe we'll never have an answer.
Yeah, it's hard to say what kind of tricks the readers back then used to figure out all the punctuation marks that the writer intended, basically. I think it's mostly they really studied a lot, read a lot of books, and books were written in a similar style, maybe. So
Mm,
because of experience, they could deduct like, oh, this should be there should be a pause here, or
yeah.
there was at least no official system. So it depends a bit on the reader, on the writer as well. Maybe some of them did use the characters that indicate, oh, start of sentence, beginning of end of sentence, and some of
Yeah.
them didn't, and just leave it up to the reader to spend a lot of time interpreting it.
Yeah, I mean, if you are like an advanced learner, might become easier for you, but just for the beginners, I think it would have always been a challenge, especially the kids at school who are, at the basic or like the primary school. So yeah, it's just some thought, and and I think the whole Chinese group uh, does like the Mandarin have influence on other geographies which are nearby China, let's say Japan or Korea, or even their languages?
Yes,
Do you have some idea about that?
so Chinese definitely had a lot of influence on Japanese and on Korean. Both of these countries, they used to write using Chinese characters, because they
Hmm.
didn't have their own writing system yet. And today, Japan still uses, I think, about 2,000 Chinese characters. But by now, they also invented their own script, two different scripts, actually. So Japanese, it uses partially Japanese words, Japanese alphabets, and still uses some Chinese characters as well. Only they adapted the pronunciation for their own language. Because Japanese words, they have a lot more syllables than Chinese words. So while these days they still use the writing system, but the pronunciation, you probably wouldn't recognize it. If you hear the Japanese, you wouldn't connect the pronunciation to this Chinese character if you hadn't studied it. And
That's
for Korean, they also only used Chinese characters before, but of course it was a bit difficult to learn for a lot of people. And at some point, one of the kings created a more simplified, like actually an alphabet to replace the Chinese characters. So these days in Korea, they don't use Chinese characters anymore. They exclusively use their own alphabet. But there's still a lot of vocabulary that sounds very much like the Chinese vocabulary.
okay. Okay, and that's that's a lot of information. Really interesting information for me, and also for the audience. I'm I'm just thinking like when you said like Japanese use more than one syllables. Uh, 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 d- does it mean like their grammar is a bit more easier or easily interpretable, or like does it have basically the same fundamentals as the Mandarin, like interpretations based on, for example, like there is no how do you say, there are no tones, let's say. Is it also applicable to Japanese and Korean,
Well,
or
Japanese and Korean, they don't have tones like Chinese does. And grammar-wise, they're also very different languages, because they
okay.
both use more syllables than Chinese. And well, I've never learned Japanese grammar, but I've learned Korean grammar, and they have many different patterns. So grammar-wise, it's a lot more complicated than Chinese, which is also why the Chinese characters, it's it's very difficult to really use those to write Korean or Japanese, because how are you going to indicate verb conjugations or anything? So
Yeah.
you cannot, which is why they really needed their own alphabet as well.
And do these Japanese and Korean, do they also have punctuations, or like is it recently adopted, or was it just like, does it share the same history as China, like not having punctuations but now having the punctuations?
I'm not sure about that actually. I think they always use the punctuation marks, especially for Korean. They could have from the start, because the language, like the alphabet, was only created about 500 years ago.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I'm not sure about
We
it, but
we can leave it for
hmm,
the another episode. That's no problem. Yes. Yeah, they are complicated. But talking about the similarities, like you say, like there is a lot of influence, but the you said also at the same time the grammar is different between these languages. Let's say only we take example of Japan or Japanese, Korean, and Chinese. What is similar other than that? Like other than the influence, I think, are there like
well,
words which are similar in these languages, or some other
yes,
style?
some words they are similar, but they are just probably just adopted from Chinese when Chinese was used as a language in Japan and Korea. So I think other than that, if they wouldn't have had this influence of Chinese, the languages really wouldn't have much in common, because they don't belong to the same family. And Chinese has the tones, Japanese and Korean does not. And of course, the grammar is a big difference. And even the word order is different. At least for Korean it is. As in Korean, they put the main verb all the way at the end of your sentence, which is different from Chinese, which mostly uses like English word order.
Okay. So at the same time, like as in the current times, they fall under one group, but historically or in the ancient times, they were never in the same group of family of language, right? If I understand it correctly.
But Mandarin Chinese, it belongs to its own group, just the whole Sino-Tibetan or just Chinese group. And
Okay.
I believe Korean and Japanese, they belong to a different family. Maybe they used to have some relation, but the languages are really very, very different.
Okay. Yeah, it's really interesting to learn, because it seems like if you don't know anything about the Eastern Asian cultures or languages, you might think that they all are same, but they actually are very different. But at the same time, they also have influence on each other. That's something really rare, I think, right?
Yes, and to a lot of people who are maybe born in Europe or America, with don't have experience with Asian languages, I think they might all look the same as well, because the alphabet or the writing system is so different from what we use that
Hmm.
it just all looks complicated, and maybe all complicated in a similar way. But if you really dive deep into it, you really notice that there are very big differences between all these languages. Even if it's from a neighboring country, the difference can be huge.
Yeah, very interesting. And you'd say about the Chinese group, so there is Mandarin and there's, I guess, also Cantonese. Do you?
Yes, Chinese has, well, it has many different dialects within China.
Hmm.
Mandarin and Cantonese are the two largest groups. Mandarin is basically the standardized language. It's like English for the rest of the world. They have Mandarin within China. It's like a common language.
Yeah.
Only in the south of China, a lot of people speak Cantonese. Is the other big dialect within the group.
Okay. Okay. And are there like major differences between Mandarin and Cantonese that can be observed? Or
Basically, they're almost completely different languages.
okay.
The only thing they have in common is that they use the same writing system as do all the dialects in China, because it makes no sense to invent a new system.
Yeah. Yeah.
But they pronounce the characters differently. They have even more tones in Cantonese. So if you let a Mandarin speaker and a Cantonese speaker have a conversation, well, they cannot understand each other. Maybe they can pick up one or two words that happen to sound similar, but other than that, it's almost impossible.
Yeah. I think it sounds uh, very complicated to me. And let's say if we compare Dutch and German languages, when the two people speak to each other, I mean, still to some extent, people can understand each other. What is your experience and thought on that?
Yeah, so German and Dutch, they're really, really closely related. So even German speakers who have never studied Dutch before or the other way around, you can get some of the meaning of what people are saying
Yeah,
because some of the vocabulary is identical or at least very similar.
it's
So you can understand each other more easily. But in the Chinese group, this group of languages, the differences are sometimes so big that you really cannot understand a word what the
mm.
other person is saying.
Yeah. I get curious about what could have caused this. Like because organically, if you see how the languages evolve, they do have influence on each other if they have like a common land border or the nearest geography they fall in. They do influence, but at the same time, when you say Mandarin and Cantonese, they don't influence each other. Makes me wonder: is it like a forced difference, or was it organically like this, or maybe the people were not really talking to each other from the two different language belts, let's say, if you use that term. So yeah, it's also open to interpretation, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's might just have to do with the fact that China is so big. Like in Europe, like the Netherlands is so small and it's so close to Germany.
Yeah.
It's more likely to influence each other maybe than this whole like South China and other regions.
Yeah, could be. And also, I think the empires also play a role, I guess, right? Because there was a huge influence of Roman Empire. So maybe a lot of people were coming together for some reason, carrying out a work or something. This is just my interpretation. But maybe in China, like the empires were in a setting where people from different language belts were not really interacting or having a chance to interact with each other. But also that brings me to think of one more question. And that is there like a geographical boundary which we can say like only these people speak Mandarin and these not, or this Cantonese, or is it like mixed these days? Or was it like a
Well,
boundary in the past
mm,
and not now? What do you know anything about that?
well, mainly the boundary would really be like just the southern province in China that speaks Cantonese. So this region that speaks Cantonese, it's quite distinct. And Mandarin, it started from a few provinces, from a smaller region. But at some point, they just wanted a common language for the whole country, so that it would be more like a unified country. So
Mm,
you'd have to speak the same language. So then the government just started to make a lot of people learn this Mandarin as a common language. So this Mandarin just spreads to most of the provinces, and these days almost everyone has learned Mandarin. Even if they have their own dialect, they learn Mandarin in school.
Hmm.
And even in the provinces where they speak Cantonese, they, well, maybe not all of them, but there might be a lot of people that also speak Mandarin. Maybe not as well as they speak Cantonese, but they can also speak Mandarin usually.
Yeah, that sounds very similar to Hindi in India. So uh, Hindi is like is used as a language where people can connect to each other as a common language. Although a lot of states disagree with that, and that's a different topic. But in general, a lot of people are familiar with Hindi, and it has over the period of time came up like that, um, either with the government or some other details that maybe I'm not aware of. So it's interesting. But you say Mandarin and Cantonese are two different dialects, or they're altogether two different languages?
I think officially they call it dialects because they still belong to the same language group of
Yeah.
Chinese language. But the
Okay.
dialects are just very, very different from each other. Because there's other dialects as well within the country. Some are used. Some have more speakers than others.
Mm,
But I think most of the dialects, they're really so different from Mandarin that speakers cannot understand each other very well.
okay.
But
That's
because they still all use the same scripts, it's still classified as a similar language family.
yeah, yeah. I think it's really interesting because if I think of a dialect, let's say uh, even in Hindi, or let's say I'm very new to Dutch language, but if I hear of a dialect, still people will be able to make sense of what other person is talking about. But this doesn't sound like a case between Mandarin and Cantonese, right? As you explained.
No, the script is the same and they both use tones, but Cantonese uses more and their pronunciation is very different.
Mm. Maybe it's because of the tones and the pronunciation, which is making it different. So yeah,
Yes, and it's also the sound combinations they use in Cantonese that is also different than Mandarin. I believe they have different combinations of like vowels and consonants.
yeah. Well, I think this almost brings us to the end of this conversation. I think there are still a lot of open questions. Why, like, let's say, in the Chinese group of languages, there are dialects, but still people cannot understand each other. Uh, but yeah, there is explanations about the tones and pronunciations, which could make really the difference, or maybe the geography that led to a situation where people were not really able to influence the languages of each other from different zones, um, compared to any other typical, let's say, Dutch and German language from Europe. Lot of open questions, right? Maybe we'll cover that in the coming episodes. It was so nice to have you, Chantal.
Yeah, it was very nice to be here and join you in this episode about languages.
Yeah. So till the next time, thanks and bye bye, everyone. Hope you enjoyed it. Cheers.
Bye, everyone.
Hello, everybody. I hope you liked this episode. If you have any particular request or any feedback, please feel free to write it in the comment box, or you can write it to our email, mapsandmetaphors@gmail.com. Also, I would request you to please consider clicking that subscribe button. It gives us a lot of motivation. Also, please like and share this video so that it reaches to the wider community. Thank you so much.